Hi, I'm Kara Holbert, and I am a survivor of domestic violence. My life before I met my partner, I was a typical teenager and going to school and looking towards the future and what that was going to look like for me. I was 21 years old when I met my former partner, and we just kind of hit it off. It was more of a friendship initially before it turned romantic. He was very polite. Like he asked me if he could kiss me the first time, so very polite, cordial, and we kind of just connected and didn't really separate for many, many years. We would go out with friends and parties and what have you, and like we were always synonymous with each other. So it was always Kara and John and Kara. It was just kind of a package deal. And he did treat me very well in the beginning. He was tall, handsome. He had a very commanding presence. When he walked in a room, everyone knew he was there. He was older, so he seemed to have his life a little bit more put together than guys who were my age. Things started to kind of turn for the worse when he was going through a crisis of his own, and he self-soothed, I suppose is the best word for that, with substances like marijuana and alcohol. But the alcoholism really, I think, was a defining factor in the demise of our relationship and the beginning of the emotional and physical abuse that started. So around that time when he was going through his crisis, he became very controlling. And if I would go out with friends, he would maybe call me a few times, but he would also call all of our friends. So again, we had the same friend group, so it wouldn't be, uncommon for him to text or call them. But if I was out with them exclusively, they would get phone call after phone call, text message, where are you, what are you doing? And at that point, I feel like he was trying to isolate me from other people, but in a weird way, as a response myself, I also isolated myself. It just became easier not to go out and avoid any potential conflict by isolating myself. He was not physically abusive when I was pregnant. It was more emotional and financial abuse at that point. Obviously when you are pregnant and expecting to have a child, all of these expenses are gonna start racking up very quickly. And so it was difficult to buy myself things unless it was directly related to the baby. Typically, when I was pregnant, we would go to parties or whatnot, family outings, things like that, as a group. So I didn't feel at that time it was isolation, but there would be potential conflict if I did it without him. So we just always did it together. So if I did go out with my friends or even family members, it could be something as innocent as an Easter egg hunt or something to that effect. It wasn't necessarily this big raging party. If he disagreed with it or didn't want me to go, he would verbally degrade me and or the people that I was going to see. And I think after a while, after it's said to you so many times in so many different instances, you kind of start to believe it a little bit. You're like, maybe I'm not worthy, maybe I really am ugly or fat, or, no one will like me. These are things that were said essentially to make me feel bad about myself so that I would engage with these people, but at the same time, they're your family, they're your friends. You know, it could be my grandmother, it could have been my best friend, but nobody was good enough, essentially, to, I guess, warrant the time away that he needed and requested. The first time he was physically abusive to me was actually very soon after we were married. I accidentally broke a vase cleaning, and it was, I guess, a family heirloom of his, which I tried to glue back together. But he pulled me essentially by my hair and threw me into a closet. And I left. After that, I went back to my parents' house, and I was there for about a week. Of course, he, you know, was very remorseful, and I love you, I'll never do it again. And he was very persistent. And so I did go back, and there was no other physical abuse for quite some time. And it wasn't until probably about 7 years later, when he was in his own crisis, when it became more physical on a regular basis. So the last year was probably the most abusive year of our relationship. You know, he did threaten me physically. He threatened my son physically if I were to leave. And so for a while, that is why I stayed. I was afraid that he would follow through with those threats. And the reason for that is because of the physical abuse I had already endured, you know, due to him. I thought that it was absolutely a possibility that he would kill me. I went out with my sister when she was in town, and I got home, you know, 2:30 in the morning after, you know, the restaurant had closed, bar. I had been drinking with my sister, so I got dropped off, and that is when I ended up with 2 black eyes, and went to the makeup counter the next couple days after it had subsided slightly, but I needed to return to work. So I was there for concealer, and she just looked at me and said, "He's not worth it." And that's all she said. And honestly, nobody else had really said anything to me about the abuse up until that point, except for this stranger at the makeup counter. But things had gotten very bad where he had eating disorders. And so dinner was always a point of contention. There was always conflict around food. It was not a healthy relationship. And I remember I didn't have garlic bread to make with the spaghetti one night, and, you know, all hell broke loose over this garlic bread. Thank goodness the food had cooled, but he ended up taking the pot of sauce that was on the counter and threw it on me, and then hit me over the head with the pan. You know, I felt hurt. This is the person who is supposed to love you and protect you and be by your side, and yet they're the person who's hurting you the most at that moment. And regardless of the situation, it's never okay to physically abuse anyone, especially over a broken vase. But again, regardless of the situation, it's unacceptable. So I was very hurt and confused. I didn't know what to do. Here I had just started this family. We were looking to, you know, start our family at that point. And I had invested all this time and energy into this relationship. And so it was a very confusing time initially because I knew it was inappropriate. I didn't like it. It was hurtful. And I did eventually go back. I think that confusion was warranted, but I also know that had I stayed a little bit more steadfast in my beliefs, my core beliefs, I would not have returned. So I guess in a way, in retrospect, I did blame myself to some extent because I continued to return to someone who did not treat me well. When I left, finally, I left in the middle of the night, and he was unaware that I was gone until probably about 3 or 4 p.m. the next day. Probably about a year before I finally left, I didn't realize that I was kind of prepping for it. It was always kind of in the back of my mind. You know, I did have family who cared for me, and I didn't want them to necessarily know how bad things had gotten, but I was embarrassed and I was ashamed that, you know, I had let this happen to myself. But knowing that, I was still at a point where even though I may have been confused and I didn't want to necessarily leave this relationship that I had spent years building, I knew I wasn't being treated well. And so I did have a bank account and I hoarded gift cards, and I was in communication with my family, even though I wasn't telling them the exact extent of the abuse that was happening. They knew I wasn't happy. When he did threaten, you know, to kill me or physically harm me, if I left, I did call Refuge House, and, you know, that was probably about a month before I left, honestly. And they gave me some tidbits like turn off your location and things like that. I think the day of that I left, I called again, and I just wanted reassurance. I think that if I left, somebody else knew in case I didn't make it. So I did contact Refuge House. They did put in, I think, a call to the sheriff's house and or sheriff's department. And when I got to my grandmother's house, I basically called and reported back in that I was okay. But yeah, it was very emotionally draining, and honestly, it was one of the hardest and best things that I've done for myself. I have been going to therapy for a while, and that is definitely a great outlet for those times where I don't feel comfortable really getting into my feels in front of other people. I work out a lot, almost to the point of too much sometimes. But all those feel-good hormones and stuff that are released when you work out, I have found has really, really helped my anxiety. I've reconnected with friends and family, and so I feel like I have a really good support system now. And so I just try to focus on those things. And yes, all these bad things happened to me, and was it my fault? No. Like, I know now, it doesn't matter how small or insequential a situation may have been, it didn't warrant that type of response from anybody, and it was highly inappropriate. So I just try to focus on the good things that are happening in my life and not to let it get me down too much, because there are times where it has been hard to get out of bed. And I stayed in bed for a couple of days until I had the strength to get up the next day. So it's a work in progress. I started dating again and have now remarried. I'm a bit hypervigilant about people's feelings and how people react to me and things like that. But my now husband does know about the abuse that took place, and he is kind of part of my healing journey to some extent. He's been very supportive of me working with domestic violence groups and speaking in public about my experience. And we're just focused on building our lives together now. So I work for a nonprofit that I'm an associate director for, and we also started our own brick and mortar and e-commerce business that we're growing. So the future's very bright. It can be stressful, but it's like everyday stressful stuff. But yeah, so we just take it one day at a time and work on trying to love each other the best that we can and support each other the best way that we can, and work on building our future to the best that it can be.